It was in the shadow of the cliffs of ancient Judea, where you might say the desert kisses the Dead Sea, that a secret community once flourished. They were scribes, priests, mystics, and outcasts. They called themselves the Yachad, the community. Their enemies called them heretics. History calls them mysterious. These were the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, over 900 manuscripts, think about it, hidden in caves, preserved in jars, just waiting for 2,000 years to pass. But here's the mystery. Almost none of these scrolls date to the 1st century of the Common Era. And why's that? Why, just as the Roman Empire was tightening its grip, just as apocalyptic fires burned hot across Judea, just when their prophecies should have come true, why did they just stop writing? Why did the scroll keepers vanish? This is the story of their final days, the extinction of the Dead Sea sect. Let's rewind the scroll a bit. You see, somewhere around the mid-2nd century before the Common Era, a group of priestly dissidents basically walked out of Jerusalem. They believed the temple was defiled, the priesthood corrupt, the calendar wrong, and the world, well, it was hurtling toward judgment. And they settled at a remote outpost, today called Qumran, where the cliffs rise sort of like ribs out of the earth, and the Dead Sea glows strange and still. It was there that they built a life of radical holiness. They ate in silence. They bathed obsessively. They studied and copied scripture hour after hour. And they waited for the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. It was an apocalyptic showdown between good and evil that would cleanse the world and install a dual Messiah system, a priest from Aaron and a king from the line of David. And this wasn't just metaphor, they meant it. And they meant it to happen soon. The so-called community rule and the Damascus document, the war scroll, the Thanksgiving hymns, the heavenly liturgies, the cryptic prophecies, all of these flow from this essential belief that the end was near. From around 150 BCE to roughly 30 BCE, this community at Qumran thrived. Archaeological digs show a vibrant center of activity. Inkwells, benches, scriptoriums, evidence of ritual baths, communal meals, even coin hoards. The scrolls from this era are prolific, some of the most complex religious literature of ancient Judaism. And they weren't just copying the Torah, they were producing visionary works. The Genesis Apocryphon, the songs of Sabbath sacrifice, the prophetic commentaries called Pesharim that claimed biblical texts spoke of their time, their leaders, their enemies, and their most cryptic hero, the teacher of righteousness. He's never named, but he seems to be a priestly figure, persecuted by an opposing establishment, perhaps the Sadducees or the Hasmonean rulers. The community revered him like a prophet, even a messianic herald of sorts. But then, as the 1st century dawns, the scrolls go silent. Now here's the archaeological shocker. After around 30 BCE, the number of scrolls drops dramatically. By 50 of the Common Era, they completely vanish. there are almost no scrolls from the 1st century of the Common Era, despite the fact that this is the most explosive period in Jewish history. Why is that? Well, let's explore 4 major theories. First, the Roman Inferno. This is the most brutal. By 66 CE, Judea had had enough, and a full-blown revolt erupted against Roman occupation. Jerusalem's streets basically ran with blood. The Second Temple burned in the year 70 of the Common Era. But what about Qumran? It was hit even earlier. Roman forces marching along the Jordan Valley destroyed the Qumran settlement around 68 CE. We've got burn layers, collapsed buildings, and human remains with signs of trauma. Scholars believe that the inhabitants either fled or died. This may have been the final blow. And the scribes, so meticulous, so devoted, they didn't have time to preserve their work. So they hid it. Scrolls were stuffed into clay jars, shoved into desert caves. Some rolled tight, others folded like last-minute prayers. They weren't creating anything new. They were just burying. Second theory, the slow collapse. Not every ending is fiery. Some dissolve, basically like sand through your fingers. The Dead Sea sect had placed all of their chips on divine intervention. They calculated exact years based on their 364-day solar calendar. They expected the final war. They expected the arrival of their dual messiahs, 2 of them. They expected the purification of the temple. But the decades passed. The temple remained basically in enemy hands. The 2 messiahs never arrived. Rome grew stronger. Maybe the inhabitants of the community just grew tired. Perhaps their leadership fractured. Perhaps the teacher of righteousness died and no prophet rose in his place. There's even a chance that Qumran was already dwindling by the time the war came. Not destroyed by Rome, but slowly emptied by disillusionment. Third theory, that the community was swallowed up by competing movements. While the Dead Sea sect was waning, 2 powerful forces were rising. There were the Pharisees, flexible interpreters of the law, who would become the great rabbis of old, and the early followers of a Galilean teacher named Yeshua, or Jesus. Both movements inherited and transformed the sect's ideas. The idea of 2 messiahs, well, it was refashioned into a suffering servant who would return one day in glory. And what about apocalyptic judgment? Well, that became central to early Christian teaching. Purity, resurrection, angels, dualism, these weren't just Qumran ideas anymore. They were mainstreamed. The sect may have simply been outpaced, and in a strange twist of fate, their theology lived on, but they didn't. The fourth theory, it was all about nature's wrath. Let's not forget, Qumran wasn't exactly a paradise. It was dry, salty, dangerous. The region was prone to earthquakes and flash floods. Seismic evidence shows a major quake around 31 BCE. and others later. It's entirely possible that natural disasters, not armies, made the site untenable. The scriptoriums may have cracked, the water channels collapsed, the caves became inaccessible, and this fragile community just withered away. In the end, we may never know exactly how the scroll keepers vanished, but we know why they mattered. They preserved some of the earliest copies of the Hebrew Bible. They opened a window into the spiritual chaos of Second Temple Judaism. They showed us a Judaism that was mystical, apocalyptic, even radical. And while their world collapsed, their words didn't. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd tossed a stone into a cave and cracked open a secret frozen for 2 millennia. Today, scholars pore over the scrolls, mapping their language, their calendar, their rituals, their dreams, and the voices of the scroll keepers whisper again today. They whisper of a world on the brink, of a people preparing for the end, and a desert silence that still echoes.
Blessed is the one who walks in the perfection of the way, who does not speak wickedly with a lying tongue, who does not retaliate with evil, who judges justly.
But what if the Qumran sect wasn't the only game in town? What if, in the end, the scroll keepers were just one thread in a much larger tapestry? What if Enochic Judaism, the visionary movement behind the book of Enoch, and angelic hierarchies, divine judgment, and two-faced messiahs survived Qumran's fall? You see, there's a dangerous habit that scholars sometimes fall into. We assume that the Essenes of Qumran and the Essenes of Josephus were the same, but maybe they weren't. Josephus, our ever-loyal chronicler of first century Judea, tells us something odd, that the third wall of Jerusalem stretched down through the place called Bethso to the gate of the Essenes. Wait a minute, Essenes? In Jerusalem? This isn't some dusty outpost in the desert. It's the beating heart of ancient Jewish life. And what's more, Josephus names 4 Essenes in Jerusalem by name. Judas, preaching to disciples inside the temple. Menachem, a prophet who warns Herod with unsettling accuracy. Simon, a seer in Jerusalem. And John, who's no mystic monk, he's one of the 6 generals of the Jewish war. And this doesn't sound like a pacifist commune by the Dead Sea. It sounds like a religious movement, urban, public, diverse, and a lot more integrated than the Qumran scroll sect. Now, get this. The early rabbis compiling the great commentary on the book of Genesis called Genesis Rabbah have some pretty sharp words for a certain biblical character. His name? Enoch, the mysterious antediluvian fellow who walked with God and was no more. Well, you'd think they'd admire him, but nope, instead they accuse him. The rabbis suggest that he was hypocritical, maybe even deserving his sudden disappearance. And why such a shade? Because Enoch wasn't just a character anymore. He was a symbol. The Enoch of Second Temple lore, especially in the so-called Book of Watchers, had become a heavenly judge, an angelic figure, sort of a proto-messiah. And that's at the heart of what we call Enochic Judaism. The rabbis weren't just critiquing a biblical figure, they were drawing a line in the sand. Whatever Enochic Judaism was, they wanted no part of it. And now, let's head down to Egypt. The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria writes of a fascinating sect called the Therapeutae. They lived by Lake Mareotis near Alexandria in isolation, men and women alike renouncing property, living in huts, spending their days in fasting, prayer, and the interpretation of sacred texts. Sounds familiar? That's because the Therapeutae were almost certainly a branch of the Essenes, but a radically different one. Their customs diverged from the Palestinian Essenes. They weren't militant, they weren't part of any priestly dispute in Jerusalem. They were autonomous, mystical, contemplative, living as if heaven had already begun. And unlike the Qumranites, they celebrated a kind of spiritual equality across gender lines. Their Sabbath gatherings included philosophical hymns and ecstatic dances. It's Essenism reimagined in the sands of Egypt. And here's the final twist. Early Christianity doesn't look much like Qumran, but it does look an awful lot like mainstream Essenism. Let's think about it. Communal meals, property held in common, celibacy and asceticism in some circles, apocalyptic expectation, a Messiah who suffers and returns in glory, a war between the sons of light and the powers of darkness. Even the Sermon on the Mount feels like it could have been from an Essene scroll. Blessed are the poor, the meek, the pure in heart. The earliest followers of Jesus weren't copying Qumran's strict codes, but they were shaped by the broader Enochic Essene atmosphere of Second Temple Judaism. In a strange turn of history, the Essenes may have vanished from the pages of Josephus, but reappeared in the pages of the New Testament. So maybe the extinction of the Qumran sect wasn't really the end. Maybe it was just the closing of one chapter. The desert scribes perished, but their dreams, their apocalyptic hopes, their belief in angels, judgment, and a coming kingdom, those ideas kept marching on through Jerusalem's crowded streets, across Egypt's shimmering sands, and into the hearts of new movements that would reshape the world. The scroll keepers are gone, but the fire they lit still burns. If you enjoyed this journey into the mystery of Qumran, be sure to subscribe and share with fellow history seekers and soul searchers. And remember, keep your eyes on the scrolls and your heart in the desert.